This session is about the Beacon Journal, which won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage 50 years ago, but also a then and now. You know, what did they cover then, and then what might that look like now? I have asked, I think, a wonderful group here, and I get to sit down and eat another cupcake. I know, right? So Bruce Wingus, the former editor of the Beacon Journal, who will moderate the session. Andrew Meyer, I'm just going in the order they're sitting here with me. Andrew Meyer, the news director of WKSU, who, how old did you say you were when May 4th happened? Like at 5 years old. So he'll be able to bring a very different perspective to that. I won't ask you, Michelle. Michelle Everhart, the digital and innovations editor at the Columbus Dispatch, and Tim Smith, former professor here and former reporter at the Beacon Journal at the time of the shootings. So I'm going to turn it over to Bruce. You guys are the diehards. Oh, I shouldn't have used that word, right? But, you know, as always, be very, very curious and ask any questions that you have. So, Bruce.
Good afternoon, and I'd like to congratulate you all on making it to the matinee. As Jan said, I'm Bruce Wingus. I'm not Aaron, I'm not Clayton, and I'm not Amelia, and I'm not Madison. I've retired as editor of the Beacon Journal this year, and it's been a good day so far, packed with a lot of information. And for our last session, we're going to mix a little bit of history with a little bit of current events. We'll leave time for questions from you, and it looks like we can take questions from each individual person out here, so that's great. About what happened then and how that applies to what's going on today. Let me just set the stage a little bit for those of you to bring it back around from what was discussed this morning. On April 30th, 1970, President Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia. That expanded the Vietnam War significantly. There were protests on college campuses across our country. At Kent State over the weekend leading to May 4th, protesters rioted in downtown Kent, shattering storefront windows. Protesters burned the ROTC building. And on Sunday, May 3rd, Governor Jim Rhodes called out the Ohio National Guard to restore order in Kent. On Monday, May 4th, there was a protest near Taylor Hall, which is not that far from where we are today. The National Guard, ordered the crowd to disperse. They fired tear gas. The Guard advanced on the crowd and fired on the protesters. 4 people were killed and others were injured. The Akron Beacon Journal, as Jan mentioned, won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the Kent State shootings. And we're going to talk about that coverage and first go back to that day. But first, keep in mind a few things about 1970. There was no internet. There were no cell phones. There was no cable news. Cameras used film, and they had contact sheets and that kind of stuff. And reporters called their stories into the newsroom. So we have one person on our panel today who was working in 1970 at the Beacon Journal. We have a couple other panelists here who are a little bit younger. Tim Smith, introduce yourself and tell us what you were doing in May of 1970.
I want to preface my remarks by noting that I'm trying to recount events that happened before most of you in this room were born. Oddly enough, while I have trouble remembering what I did yesterday, some of the events of May 4th, 1970 are quite vivid in my mind. I was a 26-year-old general assignment reporter working on the city desk at the time. Most of the reporting about Kent State was being done by suburban reporters working on the state desk, younger reporters who hadn't been there and I had only been there for 3 years. I recall I was working in the office. This happened shortly after noon on May 4th, when somebody said students had been shot at Kent State. I think somebody got a phone call, but I won't swear to it. I don't remember exactly how we got the news. But communication was spotty at best. Bruce has already stomped on some of my better lines by commenting about the nature of communication at the time. We were cut above smoke signals and carrier pigeons, but just barely. There were phones all over campus, but faculty and staff were not anxious to let any strangers use them, least of all a bunch of commie pinko students out protesting. They did have some devices in some buildings that you could put money into and actually make a phone call. You can still see some of those in the Smithsonian. Information was scarce. In the office, the main edition of the paper had already gone to press. Our last edition for the vast majority of our readers was already on its way out the door. We only had a stock market edition left. That's the one that you see on the screen right now. 4 dead, 11 wounded, its guard. That was an edition that we had, that was Jack Knight's edition. We published that one because Jack liked to know what the stock prices were before he went home for the day. Not that we ever delivered it to many people, mind you. Most of the people had already gotten an edition that had said protests were continuing, rioters were being troublesome. I was sent to Robinson Memorial Hospital, which is now the county administration building in downtown Ravenna, or on the south side of Ravenna. An editor, and it was probably city editor Ron Clark, who wanted me to use back roads to get out to Ravenna. We needed somebody in Ravenna. We had at least one reporter there, but we only had a couple reporters on campus. We didn't know anything. We didn't know who the killed or the wounded were. We didn't know how many were wounded. We didn't know how many victims there were in the shooting at the point. But the roads into Ravenna, into Kent, were blocked off. We knew that they were trying to keep troublesome types from coming in, particularly from Cleveland was the story that we'd heard. More of these riotous student-type people or outsiders who just wanted to go have a good time were being kept out of town. So I took a back road, took several back roads. The idea being I could get through. What I hadn't counted on was that these back roads had their own guardians, farmers, vigilantes, guys with shotguns and ball bats, at least one pitchfork, as I recall. They were all stopping me at intersections, wanting to know who the hell I was and what I was doing and where I was going. And it didn't really help my standing much to say I was a reporter. That was about a notch below the Kami Pinko protesters. Keep in mind, too, this is 50 years before fake news and journalists are enemies of the people. But I did make it to Ravenna eventually, into the hospital, which was a chaotic scene. We had all kinds of people there that was full of family members, full of students, full of people who didn't know anything, trying to interview people who hadn't been at the event or had been on campus but hadn't seen anything. What we didn't know is who the victims were. Official sources weren't talking, but a Beacon Journal reporter named Bob Page was also at that hospital, and he recalls that we'd run into a state senator named Bob Stockdale. Bob was a faculty member here at Kent State and also a state senator. And he loved to talk to reporters. And he'd also sort of fancied himself at this point as the spokesman for the university. And he had in his hand a list of the killed and wounded. And he wouldn't give it to us. He wouldn't tell us who was on it. So I started talking to him. And while I was talking to him, Bob was able to look around the corner at the list in his hand and get the names off the top of the list. And then I had run out of things to say, and so Bob picked it up. And Stockdale turned to talk to Bob, and I was able to read the bottom half of the list. We got the names of the killed and wounded, the ones you saw in the paper there.
Did you think that was an ethical thing to do?
You bet your ass. My job was to get the information. I didn't lie, cheat, or steal. I just peeked. That was my major, in fact, my only contribution to our May 4th coverage. I spent the day out there, but then went back to the office, and the bulk of the rest of our coverage was handled by the state desk. It was engineered and supervised by Pat Engelhardt, who was the state editor, a curmudgeoning, old, misogynistic type, who was a colossal pain in the neck, but he was a hell of an editor. Bruce had asked me, among other things, to discuss the tools that were at my disposal to cover that particular story. And so I brought them. Notebook, pen, quarters for the payphone. That was it. There were a limited number of payphones at the hospital. There was a bank of like 4 maybe, and they were in high demand. Kids were trying to call home, all kinds of hospital personnel trying to use them to let people know what had been going on. I managed to glom onto one and hogged it for the rest of the afternoon, trading it off with the occasional other reporter with the admonition that under no circumstances let this phone go. It was our only contact to Akron. We lucked out. As I recall, Akron was still a local call. Otherwise, it was long distance. You had to keep putting money in the phone. But we could get by with 1 quarter in the machine. We were swamped with rumors about what had happened and what was going on. Snipers on the dorm rooftops set off the guard. That's what caused it all. Outside agitators had come in, not students, but others had come in and provoked the whole protest, culminating in the shooting. One of my favorites was that there was a provocateur hired by the Nixon administration to stir up unrest on campus in order to justify harsh responses to anti-war protesters, which were building across the country, particularly in light of his decision to invade Cambodia. Some we were able to knock down relatively quickly, like the sniper on the rooftop of a nearby dorm. Others were harder to prove or disprove. We were reluctant to report on confirmed allegations. This is years before Fox News. Our standards were pretty straightforward. They haven't changed that much in terms of what journalistic propriety is. Multiple sources, official and private. Check them against each other to see what you can find out. And be especially suspicious of anything that sounds too good to be true. There were a lot of people who are trying to spin this story to fit an agenda, either anti-war, pro-war, whatever, anti-Republican. One thing I ought to mention in passing, and one of the reasons that the Guard was out there, was that Jim Rhodes, who was a term limited governor, was running for the U.S. Senate in an election on Tuesday, May 5th. And he was in a tight race with Bob Taft for a Senate seat. He wanted to stay in public office. He lost, by the way, one of the brighter notes of this otherwise dismal day. But he called the Guard out in part because he wanted to show how tough he was and how anti-war he was and how much he was in favor of the administration. The follow-up reporting by the State Desk, as I mentioned, was handled by Pat. But night newspapers headquarters sent in a team from papers in Detroit and Miami, including 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner Gene Miller, who was a writer out of Miami. The night team, which did include a couple of Beacon Journal staffers, produced a special section 3 weeks later that, given the time that they had to produce and the amount of information that they collected, was considerable. They did a hell of a job in producing that special section. The Beacon Journal entered its own coverage that included stories that went into the fall. John gave me a list earlier. I didn't realize that our Pulitzer entry was so extensive. It included stories into November. But one of the things that happened was our coverage was more extensive because we had more time, and we wound up winning the Pulitzer Prize. There was considerable pride in the fact that we did win that prize, but it came at a cost. Our coverage focused on the fact that the Guard didn't need to fire, that the guardsmen were not in danger. They were not threatened by the students, who were throwing a few rocks, but that was about it. That wasn't a conclusion that our Portage County readers particularly appreciated, nor were they prepared to accept it. We lost almost 7,000 circulation almost overnight in Portage County, and we never got it back. Basically, we told a story that people didn't want to hear. I think it was an accurate story, and later investigations supported that, the fact that the FBI did an investigation and said the Guard wasn't in danger. And there was a grand jury that sort of exonerated all the people involved, but the grand jury never saw some of the details of that report. I'll add just one footnote. Our coverage continued sporadically for the next several years. One reporter particularly who had been involved in it kept digging into various angles over the years. And he filed numerous Freedom of Information requests with the FBI for various aspects of the event. So fast forward 15 years. Now I'm the managing editor of the Beacon Journal. 2 of my staff members come into my office one day lugging a huge carton, and I mean big. It took 2 people to carry it, big and heavy. And they're grinning from ear to ear. Here's the stuff we asked the FBI for in 1970, they said. It's here. And they plopped it down on my desk, opened the box up, and there's thousands of pages in there, all redacted. Everything's blacked out. but we got a lot of scrap paper out of it. Pass it on.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Andrew, introduce yourself and tell us what you were doing in May 1970.
Yeah. Hi, Andrew Meyer. I'm the news director at WKSU. Five's the magic number, I guess. I've been at WKSU for 5 years now. 1970, I was 5. I just turned 5. I can't be certain of this, but one of our family rituals was my dad would get home for dinner around 6:30. And we sat down in the kitchen every night to have dinner, and there was a small black and white television that was in the kitchen, always tuned at 6:30 to the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. I'd like to say that's part of what got me connected with current events from a pretty early age. I do have faint recollections of hearing about and learning about the shootings in 1970 at that time. Of what was going on with the Vietnam War. That was in the background. That was part of growing up at that time. That being said, 5-year-olds aren't really all that connected with the world around them. So as I grew, as through childhood and the teenage years, I think there were elements of what happened in 1970 that certainly played a part in my development, certainly from a cultural perspective. The music that came out of that time, that was the musicians who were formed during that time, certainly a part of my cultural experiences as a young man. But as a journalist, not something that I have a whole lot of direct experience and awareness with, and I would say one of the toughest things as the leader of the WKSU newsroom is really trying to get a grasp on not what happened 50 years ago here, almost 50 years, but really how WKSU covered what happened at that time. There has been an evolution with WKSU over the years. The station is 67, 68 years old at this point. In 1970, it was a very different place. It was a student-run station. Today, it is a professional operation and an NPR affiliate. Much has changed over that time, both in terms of the operation of the station and I would say its independence from the university. We are a licensee of the university. Kent State holds our license. But we pride ourselves in the fact that we are wholly independent. One of the things that I felt was important when I got here was to develop a written down ethics policy and firewall policy, which surprisingly we didn't have previously. The firewall policy, especially critical for a station that's licensed to a university, where you need to be sure that both inwards and outwards, it is clear that when it comes to editorial integrity, there's no question about, I guess, who's driving the bus. It needs to be absolutely clear that while we are good university citizens, that the editorial decision-making comes from within the newsroom and is not influenced in any way from without. Looking back at 1970, in reviewing what audio we have, what records we have, it's really hard to tell at this point. We do have some recordings, but the record keeping is not as good as it could have been.
If this were to happen today, you're the news director, how would you approach the story today?
Well, my first thing would be to tell all the reporters who are assigned to be on the ground, and I've been through this in other crisis situations, to remind them that the first thing they need to be concerned about is their own life. We reporters have a tendency to think that we are indestructible, that we are impervious. I've done many stupid things in my life as a journalist, going into situations that I shouldn't have. And I think there is a driver to think we got to get the story at all cost. We need to get the story, but the final cost can't be our own lives. So, number one, it's reminding the reporters who work with our team that they need to watch out for their own safety. If they feel they're in danger, they need to step back. They need to get out of harm's way for the moment and take stock and figure out the next best approach to coming back at the story. So that they're getting the story, number one, but they're not putting themselves in ultimate harm's way.
You heard Tim say that he and his cohort peeked around the corner at some pieces of paper to get some information. How would you get information, let's just say, on who the victims were, and how would you verify information today?
Well, the first thing I would do, which is something that I've noted in the reporting that we do have recordings of, is that everything seems to be very driven from the official perspective, and there certainly seems to be, without hearing the full 24 hours worth of recordings, which I don't think really exist, a bias, a slant towards official sources. And
So that was in 1970.
that was in 1970, with no eyewitness sources there.
And reminding our audience, this was a student-run operation.
It is a student-run operation, yeah.
Okay.
But in looking back over the history of WKHU's coverage of what happened in 1970, there's been some tremendous reporting that's been done in terms of follow-ups, documentaries, interviews. But in the very moment, what seems to be missing is that human perspective, that from both sides.
You also heard Tim mention that Knight Ridder sent in some, or Knight newspapers, I guess at that time, not Knight Ridder yet, I'll sit corrected, sent in some help, reporting help. Would you get any help from NPR today if this happened in your backyard?
Oh, absolutely. We would be the front line because we're here, but it's important to think about the old ideas and conceits of competition in the current marketplace. One of the key buzzwords for us in our newsroom these days is collaboration. And yes, we all have our own audiences to serve, and of course we want to get the big scoop. But I think there is a true consensus out there that there's no one organization out there, print, TV, radio, new media, that can do it all by themselves and own the story. What I've done in my 5 years at WKSU is look to build relationships with other public radio stations, with the Akron Beacon-Journal, with the Record Courier, with other print organizations in Northeast Ohio, with television stations, with new media, so that when something big does happen, then we're not starting from scratch saying, hey, how can we work together? Or better yet, with the staffs that we do have, that we're not tripping over each other trying to chase the same story when there are many different facets that we should be covering, and if we work collaboratively, we can effectively do so.
Okay. We just had a session on a video that went viral kind of before it was verified. How would you treat social media in your reporting?
Probably the same way I would Wikipedia, which is it's an interesting place to see ideas and to learn about what's going on, but not treat it as the gospel. Okay, there's information out there on social media. What's the source? How do I confirm it? How else can I double check what I'm seeing out there before then proceeding with it as something that I would consider to be news, something that I can bank on?
Would you use social media, Tim, or no, you had mentioned, excuse me, that it was officialdom in 1970. Would you use social media maybe to try to find people who witnessed it? Or
Absolutely,
like
absolutely. It can be a very effective tool in trying to find sources.
Okay. Anything else about covering that story today?
No.
Okay. Michelle, I guess, how old, well, never mind. You know, You had something happened in your neck of the woods here last month. The recent shootings in Dayton were a big story for the Columbus Dispatch. And how did your newsroom hear about these shootings, and what was the first thing you all did when you heard about the shootings?
So we found out about it. It happened on a Saturday night, Sunday morning. I woke up, a little bit of background, I'd just gotten back from a very lovely vacation in the Smoky Mountains with my family. I was relaxed. My husband is an investigative reporter with the Dispatch. We both kind of needed that break and to chill out. So we both worked at the Dayton Daily News for a number of years. So when I woke up, you can see on the news alerts, I see all these news alerts that there's been a shooting in Dayton. We have friends that live in the Oregon District. We still have very good friends who work for the Dayton Daily News. I have family that lives down there. My sister, her husband works for the fire department. So my first thought was, is everybody we know okay? And then my second thought was, we're really far behind at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I don't know if we have anybody on the ground there. I had a text message from Alan Miller, our editor, who said, do we need to go? And he sent it to Kelly Lecker and I, the other assistant managing editor. And I said, yeah, absolutely, we have to go. And about 20 minutes later, my husband gets a phone call saying, you need to go to Dayton. So I had to apologize to him for that he, but he has the sources. He has good sources with the mayor. He has good sources with the state representative down there because he worked there for a number of years, and it absolutely made sense to send him down there because we are, while that is in our neck of the woods, it's outside of our coverage area, so we are still kind of parachuting into this, and we're already behind because it happened at about 1 o'clock in the morning. You'll see on that, the first, can you go back one more? It's okay. So we use a tool called Data Miner, and it is something, we just started using it this summer, and it basically scours social media for something that is about to go viral or some like a big event. I get a lot of potential mass shooting alerts. It's kind of stressful. As I'm sitting here, I'm getting these alerts on my watch right now, and it gives you a heads up. A lot of these times we get these alerts before they're even liked or retweeted. I don't know how they do it. It's amazing. But it gives us that alert. So that's the first tweet that went out about what happened. It says Oregon, but it was the Oregon District. That went out at 1:32. It was tweeted at 1:17. So that's how we first find out about these things. That's how we found out about Jeffrey Epstein's suicide. And that's how we got our story out before the Washington Post and CNN and all of that. Jeffrey Epstein, if you don't know, has connections with Les Wexner, who is richest man in Ohio, lives in New Albany, big-time player in Columbus. There's been a lot of interest in this story. So we had our story out before any of them because we got this data miner alert. So we sent 3 people down there to Dayton to start covering it. And then we started working everything back at the office. We were updating regularly. Our first story up was an Associated Press story. I had a web producer in about 5 o'clock in the morning. She saw what was happening, got our website updated, and then that story got picked up by Google. And by that I mean that when you search for any information about the Dayton shooting, our story was like on the first couple articles that came up about it. We could see from our analytics that we were getting a lot of traffic from Google on that. And we also know because of that, if we keep updating that story, our story is going to keep coming up higher in the search results. And this is really important. You want to be first. You want to be fast. We were already at a disadvantage because we were late on it. I mean, I don't know what time WHIO and Dayton Daily News got their stories up. By the way, they did an amazing job. I don't know how they have survived this year. If you don't know, they have dealt with tornadoes, they've dealt with a KKK rally, and then they had these shootings. And it is, I'm sure, taken a toll on their newsroom, and I feel for my friends there. And they've done an amazing job covering all of it. But the important thing for us is that we want to be first, we want to be fast, we want to be accurate. You have to be accurate if you're going to be first. You don't want to have to make those mistakes and corrections. And if you do, you have to be very transparent about it. We get our story up, we see that Google's picking it up, we just keep updating with what the wire is. And then we have our reporters on the ground doing what they do. We have some at the press conferences, getting the official word. We have some at the scene, talking to people who are still there, and just getting the color of what is happening, what are people doing. And they're sending that back to us, and we are updating the website. I wish I would have counted how many times we updated the website that day. I mean, we probably had 7,500 plus updates. It was just a constant. Every time we had new news, either from The Wire or from our own, we would update it. Photo galleries, video, any way that we could tell the story, that's what we were doing.
So you heard Tim talk earlier about having a stock edition final, and so your deadlines today are much different
Yes.
than the stock edition final. I think that's pretty obvious there. What tools did you use to verify the information you were getting? You're doing these 75 updates. You're obviously getting something from the Wire services, but you're also hearing stuff from other sources. How are you filtering all that out?
I mean, we're looking at social media to see what's happening. I use social media as kind of a starting place to see what is happening on the ground, especially if we're not there. And then you're trying to verify it with people that you trust, whether that's other journalists, whether that's officials, whether it's talking to people. I think you're still using your basics in journalism. Social media, we always have to be careful with. Back to the Dayton tornadoes, we had people sending us photos from social media of damage from it. And you look at the Twitter bio of this person and they're in Oklahoma. And I'm like, I don't think this is actually the Dayton tornado. I think this is somebody who's just trying to get Twitter famous and get a bunch of likes and retweets. So you just have to do what you know how to do. You verify it. You go and look. Does this make sense? If it doesn't, then you go find something else.
When you all were doing your coverage, especially during the first day, did you run across any ethical stumbling blocks or anything that made you stop?
We had a couple. The first one was the video during one of the press conferences. They showed how quickly the officers moved in and killed the shooter, and they showed all of it. And we had a reporter who did a video of that and sent it back to us. And we had to talk, like, do we really want to show this? Do we really want to show somebody dying? Is it important enough to tell the story, or can we use words to tell the story? I am pretty conservative in this, that I don't think we need to show somebody dying, especially a shooter. I don't know what that's going to do to other people who may want that kind of infamy, who want to do that awful, recreate that event. I think we could clearly tell people that it took less than 10 seconds for the officers to move in and kill the suspect without showing that video. And Alan Miller and I had that conversation. We agreed. We just didn't need to shoot it or show it. If there were questions about what had happened during that shooting or how that shooter was killed, then I think it's something that we would have talked about more, like the North Carolina or the South Carolina shooting video that we saw earlier. That's really important to show, because there was question about what happened. There was no question at that point what happened. I'm glad we had the video. In case there is any question about it, we have it, and then we can use it in the future.
And what's been your long-term plans for coverage of the Dayton shooting, or what have been? We've made it past the first couple of days, 75 updates.
Sure.
What's next week? What's next month?
Because we are in the state capitol, our long-term coverage really has been covering what happens at the State House and how they're reacting to this. We worked with a few other Ohio media outlets, the Enquirer, the Dayton Daily News, Akron, Canton, Toledo. Anybody else I'm forgetting? To survey all the lawmakers. Mike DeWine, the governor, put out a bunch of policies and proposals that this is what we're going to do, including a red flag law. So we asked all the lawmakers, do you agree with this? Is this something that you're willing to vote for? Is this something you're willing to back? And put a story out together like that. That was a really great example of collaboration that I'm really proud that we were able to do. And now we're at the State House daily whenever they're having something about this. We're trying to let people know what your representatives are doing to make a change, if they're doing anything.
This is a question for all of you. What do you see as the main difference between the audience of 1970 and the audience of 2019? Tim, you're the...
People have gotten so used to having instant information that they don't want to wait for it. They don't want to let the dust settle a little bit. I see there's an enormous pressure to get something out now, even though you may not know very much. Mm-hmm. One of the luxuries of working for a newspaper was ahead of day, basically. We could get the story today and publish it tomorrow, and we had a chance to find out what was true and what wasn't. That's a luxury that so few news organizations have these days because everything's online and everything's instant. And the population has become accustomed to that. That's the standard. And that's a tough norm to beat.
Andrew or Michelle, how's that affected your reporting today?
I mean, it's exhausting. We're working 24/7 and trying to keep up with it. And you're answering if you're hearing a lot from people if they don't think you've reacted quick enough. And you have to be very transparent about why we didn't post that right away. We're looking into it. We can't, just because you see it on Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat or wherever, does not mean that it's fact. And we have a responsibility to verify it. So not only are you trying to do the reporting behind the scenes, you're explaining to people, we're reporting this. Like, you have to be a little bit patient, but people aren't patient. They want to know now.
I would agree with the idea of the 24/7 aspect where we are now, that people expect immediate information, they expect immediate analysis of what's going on. I would suggest that maybe radio for a long time has been closest to this model. 25 years ago, when I think it was 25 years ago, when I was working for an all-news station, radio station in New York City, you'd be on for an 8-hour shift as a reporter, and they would send you to cover a story. And if it was breaking news, they expected you to be ready to go as soon as possible. So once you got to the scene, talked to your sources, attended the news conference, whatever the situation was, you needed to call in and check with the editor. And you had to have the full expectation that when you called in and talked to the editor, they were going to say, okay, you're going live now. So you had to be ready. In a way, that was a precursor to where we are now. So it's having the understanding that you need to be ready to deliver the goods when you check in, but also when it comes to being ready, knowing that you're certain about the facts that you have. And it is exhausting.
Tim, you talked a little about the drop in circulation that the Beacon took after the reporting on Kent State. You also talked a little bit about trying to get to Ravenna through back roads and being stopped and challenged. Why were those people out there? What gave them the right to feel like they should be blocking roads? What was their mindset, I guess, at that time?
Well, the attitude seemed to be that our community was in trouble. This little island of liberalism is in the middle of an extremely conservative area. And the people who live out here aren't of the same mindset of the students who are going to school here, or for that matter, most of the faculty. The people who were stopping me were concerned about this country. They didn't think the anti-war protesters were on the right track. They thought they were wrong. And the attitude that we encountered, unfortunately, and it persisted for the longest time, was the only problem with Kent State May 4th, 1970 was that you didn't shoot enough of them. And that's what I was encountering at the roadblocks, were people who were concerned about the health of their community. They saw it was under threat. Nobody calls out the Highway Patrol, the National Guard, every sheriff's deputy, and every cop within 2 counties to corral these troublesome, riotous students who were burning down the campus. Now, the fact that they burned down some old Quonset huts was lost on everybody. Yeah, and they broke some windows downtown, that's for sure. But beyond that, I mean, I look at my headlines now. I look at those headlines in that newspaper now about riotous students, and I thought, you know, I don't know that they were all that rioting. I mean, I've covered some riots in my time, and these kids didn't come anywhere near to being rioting. I mean, yeah, they started a fire, know about that. But the people out here were not pleased with what was going on, and they weren't at all bothered by what the Guard did. They were bothered by what the students were doing. And we didn't reflect that. Their newspaper, the one that they counted on to tell them what was going on, didn't report what they believed to be true, despite the fact that their facts were wrong and ours weren't. And that's not something they wanted to hear. And that's always a risk in this business.
When the Beacon was losing that circulation, do you recall if the Beacon made any kind of effort to be transparent about why it was reporting the way it was reporting, or did you just put the facts out there and let them?
No, self-examination came much later, Bruce. We weren't into that much at that time. What we were concerned with was seeing to it that the information we had was accurate. Why we were reporting information that people didn't want to hear, I guess we weren't that concerned with whether or not they wanted to hear it or not. We thought what we were doing was right, and that was sufficient. Turns out we weren't right. Turns out we were wrong in terms of sales. In terms of the impact financially on the paper, it was detrimental to the paper. Now, I don't know that anybody who was in charge at that time, or for that matter, anybody in charge now, would do it any differently. I don't know that we would gear our coverage to what the people wanted to hear. What you really want to do is gear your coverage to what's going on. If you don't like the information, do something about it, but don't complain to me as the messenger.
Michelle, what was the reaction to your all's reporting of the Dayton shootings? And can you also talk a little bit about the gun rights and gun regulation discussion going on in our state right now?
I mean, for the most part, I think anytime something like this happens, the first time somebody brings up like policy, you know, within the first hour, there's both sides like, don't politicize this. Let's just let this happen. For the most part, I think, you know, people were coming to us for the information. I don't think there was like a negative or positive feedback on the actual stories that happened. What's now is being debated in our comment sections on Facebook and all of that is more of the policy and whether these red flag laws would do anything, whether it would have changed anything with this. And it's been hard reading the comments. I'm a big proponent of reading the comments. I know a lot of journalists say don't read the comments. It can be very disheartening, but I think you have to read the comments to know what your audience thinks. And to have an understanding of who your audience is. So as hard as it is to read some of those comments, you need to know what's going on. And you also will find a lot of questions that you can answer in those comments. And maybe give them a better understanding of what's happening. You'll find holes in your own story or holes in their understanding that maybe you can work to do a better job of reporting next time.
Without giving away anything that might be proprietary, is there discussion in the Columbus Dispatch newsroom about where the coverage should go on the gun question?
I mean, I have not been as far as like the editorial side of things. I'm not part of that. So,
I understand, but I'm talking about news coverage.
News coverage. I mean, our first priority is just to let people know what's happening at the State House and what our lawmakers are doing, and that's what we're working on right now.
Okay. Well, we've gone back 50 years and we've come forward to 2019. What questions are on your all's mind? And if you don't have any questions, I can do this all day. But, I think you're about ready to be surrounded, Ron.
You know, we've been talking all day about how divided the country is, but I think we tend to forget how bad it was back then in the 1970s and the late 60s. There's so much hate and fear and anger. And I'm just wondering, Bruce got to part of this in the question about how the audience has changed, but how the country has changed. Could you talk to that a bit? And I'm not sure we're out of the 1970s yet in the divisions, and I'm not sure we're ever going to be out of what we're in now. But if you could just talk a bit about how that came about and what this country is and maybe where it's going.
Well, speaking as the old guy on the panel, who remembers 1970 vividly, we were in a war in 1970, and young men were dying. A lot of them were dying. And this country was heavily divided about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, or we should be there defending against communism. And we were in the heat of it in 1970. There didn't seem to be any end in sight. And I think the country was severely divided between those who thought we were doing the right thing and we should support the president, and those who thought we weren't doing the right thing and we ought to get the hell out of Vietnam. I can see some parallels today between what the attitude was then and what the attitude was now. I think we were heavily divided in 1970. The population was split about anti-war protesters, people doing violent things in the name of peace, people saying that that's not the way that you can affect change, but nothing seemed to be working to affect change. So I see a difference, but I see some parallels to the way we are right now, with the division in part driven by the same media that Michelle and Andrew are talking about social media, about Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, particularly Twitter. Twitter's the spawn of the devil.
Yes, I agree.
And we are being torn asunder by the access to too much information at the moment, particularly information that has no way to be verified, no way to know that what you're being told is the truth. And so you fall back onto, well, this is what I believe because this is the way I feel. This is what I think is true, that it's all fake news, that you people do all bad things. You never get anything right, unless, of course, you happen to write something that I like, in which case it's okay. I encountered that in 1970. We wrote stories that said the guard fired without provocation. Now, I have a lot of sympathy for the guardsmen in 1970. They were a bunch of 18 and 19-year-old kids. They had come off guarding the Teamsters in the Teamsters strike. They were guarding strikebreakers in a Teamsters strike, and the Teamsters are not somebody to fool around with. The Teamsters had guns, and they were using them. And the guardsmen were escorting the truckers who were violating the Teamsters strike, and the guardsmen weren't given bullets. But they sent them out here, and they gave them bullets. But guardsmen aren't designed to control student demonstrations. The highway patrol was barely able to control it, and there were only a handful of highway patrolmen. They shoved those kids into a situation in which they should never have been stuck. Now, why'd they shoot up on the hill? I don't know. I don't know why. I have my own suspicions, but some people thought that no matter what was going on, the students had no right to do what they were doing, and therefore they were all in the wrong. A lot of these kids were really upset about us being in a war, and a number of them could have been fodder in that war in the next year or two. I mean, there was a draft going on. People were at risk of being sent to Vietnam. So that was a problem, and it was exacerbating the feelings about right and left in 1970. I can see, unfortunately, some parallels today.
You all want to add anything?
Well, I would agree with the whole idea that what we're dealing with, that things are as bad right now, I think, as they were 50 years ago in terms of the divisiveness of the country. But you talk about the idea of confirmation bias, which was true then, maybe exponentially so now. But one of the roles that I think we have, one of the responsibilities that we have as journalists, is to be out there on the front lines when it comes to helping people understand and, in a way, teach them how to be good consumers of media, of all media, so that there is awareness, so they make better choices, so we can break this cycle of confirmation bias, which is just getting worse and worse.
Anything to add, Michelle?
I was on the University of Wisconsin campus in 1970, and we had lots of protesters, and one huge advantage we had is we got to watch the war on television. The networks actually reported a heck of a lot different than what you see in Afghanistan. No, don't show that. We have a question here.
Hi, Patty Newberry, Miami University. I want to play off a question that Eric Gardner raised at lunchtime about whether news organizations are ignoring the everyday gun violence in their community. So you rise to the occasion, of course, if there's a mass shooting. So maybe Andrew and Michelle, in your communities, what's your strategy, your coverage strategy on the everyday gun violence?
I'll take the lead on this one. All right, WKSU is public radio. We feel that it is important when it comes to news coverage that we are doing coverage that connects with our communities, that really speaks to where their interests, where their concerns are. Everyday gun violence is tragic, but commercial media sensationalizes it for ratings. If it bleeds, it leads. I've been on that side. I know what it's like. What we need to do as a news organization is to take a look at what's going on and look at the larger issues that are there, not just the individual instances of crime. and look at what's not working in our communities, report on what's not working in our communities, report on what is working and needs more attention, more effort, and that's where we need to focus our reporting. One of the things that I've done in the last year is to create a set of story selection guidelines. It's a basic 2-page document, but it serves as a reminder to every member of the team what they should be thinking about when it comes to the stories that they pitch, the stories that they choose for newscasts, the stories that we should be covering, and the stories that maybe individually we shouldn't be covering and why we're not covering them, but how we maybe should cover them instead.
We have,
That currently is not, I don't think so.
we have these
It's a good point.
discussions a lot about how we're covering. A couple years ago, Columbus was having like a record year of murders. And so we covered that heavily. And reporters question, are we covering this too much? And just the everyday gun violence, are we covering it too much? Are we highlighting it too much? We talk about it with our Reader Advisory Board. We meet monthly with a group of people for a year, about 30 to 40 people. We're in our 3rd year of it now. And we ask them, what do you want to see? And they were very interested in the crime and what's happening. The problem with some of that, I think, though, is that you don't want people in the suburbs to think that that's all that's happening in the city. And so you have to balance. I think it's a really good point. You have to show what's working in the city, what good things are happening. We look for trends. We try to point those out. We see what police are doing about it. We try to get into the neighborhoods and build that trust, but I don't know that we have it right yet. And it's something that we're constantly working on.
Just to follow up, our ethics and firewall policy is posted on our website, and that is a very good suggestion, so I'm going to take it back to my immediate bosses and see what they think about the idea, if we should craft a version of it that should be outward-facing.
I was struck by something Tim said in the beginning of his comments about the fact that when you went back and looked at what you had done, you were reporting through November on Kent State, if I recall, that you said that correctly. So with my question to anyone who wants to take it is, with local media being less and less locally owned, would there be the appetite and the patience for covering a story for that long, especially when you could see such a steep decline in at readers and subscribers today? Would there be that kind of tolerance and patience by ownership, including Gatehouse?
We aren't locally owned anymore, but they at no point have come in and said, you're going to cover this way. They've left all editorial decision-making to us, to Alan Miller, who's been there since 1982. And I think it's a really important point that we keep trying to explain to people, because we get those letters of like, oh, now you're just a liberal New York paper. And no, we are still in our community. That all of us still live in our community. All of our children go to school with your children. We're still covering this community as we would had we been under the wolves before. In fact, I think we have a little bit more editorial freedom now that we're not owned by the wolves. A lot. So that's not a problem for us.
Even if you could see a sharp decline in readers?
I think we talk about that too, what balancing if there's a sharp decline, then we're not reaching our readers, and how can we change that? Are we not telling the story the way we should? Are we not explaining the importance of it? We do look at analytics all the time, and one of the things, if something is not doing well online, but we still think it's very important, then we've got to figure out a way to connect with our readers and let them know that it is important, and we're going to keep doing that.
And just to add to that, one of the things that we feel strongly about is engagement with our audiences, so that we have a better idea of the reporting that they're looking for, so that we're not 7 journalists sitting around a table deciding for 22 counties in Northeast Ohio, here's the news you have to know, because they're an important part of the equation.
And I can only add, as a retired editor, that corporations realize that the local journalists are the ones who are most connected to their community, and that they are the ones who can decide pretty much what's best for their community to cover. Having said that, also, the very real thing of losing 7,000 circulation, I think that the evolution of transparency helps in that. And if you can explain to your audience why you're doing something and then give them a voice to say why they think you shouldn't do it, that helps in that. Anything that costs money, of course, is going to be a discussion. But
Hi, I'm Melody Conrad. I'm with University of Dayton, a journalism senior. This is just kind of like a basic overall journalism ethics question, but seeing how you guys have been covering, like we were covering the Kent State shooting and then this Oregon shooting, how do you guys reconcile, respecting sources and really making sure that you're paying attention to who they are as people and respecting them, while also making sure that you guys are attaining the best version of the truth? Like, what kind of methods, what kind of steps are you guys going through to make sure that you're doing that? This can be for anyone.
I think having a good relationship with those sources in the first place helps. If you're talking about officials, they know you have a job. And most of the time, if you have a good relationship with them, they're going to accept that you're doing your job, just like we accept they're doing their job when sometimes they say, no, I'm not going to explain this to you. So it starts before the breaking news happens. You have to have those local ties, those local sources, and those relationships built.
I would echo that. One thing I like to tell, not just to sources, but remind my reporters about is that what good is a quick got you if you lose a source in the long term? You've got to weigh what's going on there. The other thing to keep in mind is not to forget your humanity in the moment. On 9/11, I was standing with a clear perspective of the towers burning, and I was standing next to a guy who was pale white, and I was there to talk to people. This is about 10 miles away, and I started to talk to him, and it turned out that both his wife and his young daughter were in the World Trade. His daughter was in daycare there. His wife had dropped her off there. He was dialing, trying to get through. He wasn't having any luck. I put down my tape deck, my mic, I pulled out my phone. I said, what's the phone number? And we both tried. We couldn't get through. I have no idea what happened. But there are times where you got to remember you're human.
Andrew, this one starts at you. You mentioned earlier about confirmation bias. There's been a lot of talk about declining trust in the media, especially in conservatives. And it seems the solution that everyone's offering is transparency. But how can you be transparent when people aren't going to read your news in the first place? So is this a problem that journalism can solve?
It's not easy. And you got to just stick with it. You can't give up after one attempt, after 3 attempts, after 5 attempts. Sometimes it's on the human level. It's on the one-to-one level. It's getting out and actually talking to your audience, not talking at them, giving them the opportunity to meet you, to express their concerns, to share their ideas. Getting a chance, again, we come to the human element, getting a chance to know you and realize that you're not really that different than they are, that you also are part of this community and concerned about what goes on in it. Sometimes it's a hard-fought battle. Sometimes you may never reach everyone you want to, but that doesn't mean you should give up.
Hi, or you can go.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I actually had a question for you. So I also go to the University of Dayton, and I'm the online editor, so when you were talking about analytics and reading all the comments, I really felt like you were speaking to me in that moment. In regards, in our coverage of the Dayton shooting, we didn't use the shooter's name. We did the no notoriety campaign. That was an easier decision for us. We were covering more community reactions as opposed to the breaking news itself. But do you have a position, or does your organization have a position on no notoriety and using mass shooters' names?
We don't have a position. I would say it's something that we've really started to talk about. I struggle with it because I think part of it, I think it's a really noble thing. I think that there are some very good parts of it. I think as a journalist, the curiosity of me, I want to know why this person chose to do this. And I don't think, we never know the answer. I get that, but I want to know more about them. But I think there are ways you can do that without putting it in people's faces. Like you don't put their their mugshot on the front page. You don't put it on the home page really big. We tried to be very careful about how we used the Dayton shooter's mugshot. I don't remember his name because I personally don't want to know his name. So I was very careful that we didn't use his mugshot as a main photo, because if we did that, then it's going out in the tweet. It's going out on Facebook like that. And so we were trying to make those conscious decisions of that. I don't know that we'll get to a place where we don't use the name at all. I think you do at least have to identify the person. My fear with that is the opposite. Like, if you don't identify them, then people are going to start saying that it's somebody else or whatever. I think at some point there has to be a record keeping of this is who did it. So that's where we are on it right now.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, we have one.
Speaking of the names, I understand that there was another person by the same name who looked similar, and there was a big confusion between that person who had died a couple years earlier and then the shooter, and his sister was shot and killed in the shooting. So did you guys deal with that? And if so, kind of how did you work through that?
I don't remember us dealing with that. I will tell you something else. One of the ethical decisions that I think this is really interesting. I don't know if any of you saw, you brought up the sister. A couple of days later, it came out from some articles that she was trans, or he's a trans man, but not living openly. Only a few friends knew. And we didn't know what to do with that. I mean, we're going by official record who they're identifying this person, but you have a bunch of anonymous sources saying, no, you're using that person's dead name and you're wrong and you're disrespecting them. But how do we rectify that? I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it's interesting. Again, because it wasn't really in our coverage area, we didn't have to wrestle with it too much. I think if it happened right in our area, it's something we definitely would have had to address.
In our case, being one step further removed, the issue came up very early on, as soon as this came up. And talk about having a great support network. I reached out to my public radio counterpart at WYSO. And in trading messages back and forth with her and with NPR, we were able to clearly establish, here's what they're following, here's what the network is following, this is what we're going to do. So we had expertise that we could turn to who were much closer to the scene to give us guidance.
Okay. Oops.
Sorry. This question comes from an academic ethics center out of state, via text, no less. Content moderation is an important concept in journalism. Is there a role for journalism organizations to take a more proactive approach in moderating the comments on their own social media channels?
Yes.
Yes.
Is it a practical way to go, though, given the resources of your newsroom?
I think it has to be, and granted, we don't see the same level of traffic as I think maybe the Dispatch or the Beacon Journal might see, but our comment section on our website is moderated, and we have clear guidelines that are spelled out as to how we approach moderation in terms of where the final say. There's basic rules of decorum. It's more detailed than that, but it's clear what goes into our decision-making, and that finally that we're the final decider on what gets published and what doesn't. We try to be mindful of what we see on our social media platforms, and try to apply a similar mindset there.
We recently really started moderating our comments online, just because they were such a burning trash heap of terribleness. And I was like, we can't do this anymore. Like, I just can't have this on the Dispatch site. I'm not proud of this. And we were lucky enough that we have a system in place that has like an auto moderation, so it's a first look algorithm that shuts down any comments that has hate speech in it, that uses certain words and everything like that. So that's really helpful and been great for us. I've just started going and banning people. I'm done. I'm done with these people. You're not adding to the conversation. You're breaking our rules. You're out. So I've started banning people. They're not happy about it. They call my boss and he backs me, thankfully. So Social media is a little harder. It's not as easy to do that, but we are mindful of our Facebook comments. We have a lot of words in our, if you don't know you can do this, you can put certain words that will automatically hide a comment if it's inappropriate. So we put a bunch of words in our Facebook settings that hide the comment automatically to try to prevent some of that. And then we just go through at least once or twice a day to see what's happening and do it. There's certain stories that you just know are going to be terrible and you have to watch them.
As a friend of mine frequently says, there's few advantages to being my age, but one of them is the fact that I don't have to deal with this sort of thing, and I didn't have to as a newspaper editor. All our comments came in the form of a letter. You either print it or not, and you could edit the letter. And we had certain standards that said, and we weren't going to print anything that was libelous because we'd be held responsible, unlike the social media, which is not held responsible. So I sympathize with Andrew and Michelle for having to put up with all that crap, because I fortunately didn't have to.
So
One more
just
question here.
just quick follow-up. When you ban people, do you have dialogue with them at all, or do you just shut them down?
I explain, like, you've repeatedly, I give them chances. They get 2 chances. I usually ban them for a week or a day, or depending on what it is. I explain to them what they did. And then on the 3rd strike, you're out. And I say, this is your last chance. If you don't do this, or if you break another rule, you're gone. And then some of them will reach out directly to me. I'll have a couple back and forths with them, but I'm not wasting a bunch of time on. I told one guy he needed to get outside and have a hobby. I couldn't deal with it anymore.
Okay, on that note, I thank Tim, Michelle, and Andrew. I thank you all, the audience, for your questions.